Hello, everyone. Just want to do a quick little update here for The Ghost in You. The episodes that have dropped from 1 through 20, many of those, actually all of them except for one, were recorded about a year to a year and a half ago, and they were on a different feed, and I decided to bring them over to the History Ghost Bump feed so that they could get a little bit more listenership to it. And I believe episode 10 is the only one that was a more current one. I've come to the end of those. So all of these episodes are now starting in 2025, which means that there will also be video going with them. I'm going to try to continue with the dropping one every other week. I don't know if I'll be able to do that because I've got so much content that we're creating for History Goes Bump, trying to do everything all at once and then also working almost a full-time job on top of it. Little tough, but I will try to at least do one of the Ghost in You every single month, hoping for two. Modern medicine has made it possible to raise the dead, as long as the person who's died did so very recently. So far, no one that has been dead for days has been raised from the dead. There have been attempts through history to accomplish this feat, though. Man has tried to use electricity to bring dead nerves back to life. Authors like Mary Shelley have written classic tomes about man's pursuit of this endeavor and ultimate success. But that was fiction. As they say, with God, all things are possible, and one of those things is raising of the dead. There are stories throughout the Bible of people being raised from the dead, even after they've been dead for several days. For humanity, the ultimate story of resurrection represents the foundation of salvation. Welcome to the Ghost in You podcast, a podcast about the weird, the wonderful, and the terrifying in the Bible. I'm Diane Student, your guide and host on this strange journey through the Bible. Episode 21, Raising the Dead. The human body is electrical. Our cells generate electrical signals. It reasons that electricity could bring dead cells to life. Galvanism came onto the scene in the late 18th century. An Italian physician named Luigi Galvani helped spark major buzz in the scientific field with his discoveries about the effect of electricity on muscles. Galvani had graduated from medical school in 1759, and he specialized in anatomy. Galvani was appointed curator of the Anatomical Museum by the Senate of Bologna in 1766, and through this position he gave lectures and demonstrations on anatomical operations before surgeons, painters, and sculptors. In the 1790s, Galvani had been conducting an experiment in which he had skinned some frogs, and an assistant who was working with him touched a scalpel to the sciatic nerve on one of the frog's legs, and there was a spark and the leg twitched. This intrigued Galvani, and he started looking at animal electricity. He started doing other experiments and found that when lightning struck or when brass hooks were attached to the frog's spinal cord and then touched to an iron railing, the frog's legs convulsed. In 1791, Galvani published his findings in De Veribus Electricitatis in Motu Musculari, and the science world was inspired. Scientist Alessandro Volta took these experiments further and created the first chemical electric battery. Volta called the phenomenon galvanism for Galvani. Galvani's nephew, Giovanni Aldini, went even further with the work. George Forster's wife and daughter were found dead in December of 1802. They had last been seen with him at the Mitre Tavern in London on December 5th. After their bodies were fished out of a canal, Forster was arrested and charged with their murders. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was hanged at Newgate Prison on January 18, 1803. But that was not the end for George. His corpse was taken to the house of Giovanni Aldini. Aldini wanted to make human muscles move. So in comes poor George, and Aldini hooks him up. The experiment was described in an 1887 issue of the Newgate Calendar. M. Aldini, who was the nephew of the discoverer of this most interesting science, showed the powers of galvanism to be far superior to those of any other stimulant. On the first application of the process to the face, the jaw of the deceased criminal began to quiver, and the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye actually opened. In the subsequent part of the process, the right hand was raised and clenched, and the legs and thighs were set in motion. Mr. Pass, the beadle of the surgeon's company, being officially present during the time of the extraordinary experiments, was so alarmed that on his going home, he died that night. So the experiment was so upsetting, a guy died after watching what happened. It basically gave him a heart attack, I'm assuming. Aldini experimented on dead criminals before George, though. One such experiment, Aldini described as the posterior half of the atlas vertebrae was then removed by forceps when the spinal marrow was brought into view. A profuse flow of liquid blood gushed from the wound, inundating the floor. A considerable incision at the same time was made in the left hip through the great gluteal muscle, so as to bring the sciatic nerve into sight, and a small cut was made in the heel. The pointed rod with one end connected to the battery was now placed in contact with the spinal marrow, while the other rod was placed in contact with the sciatic nerve. Every muscle of the body was immediately agitated with convulsive movements, resembling violent shuddering from the cold. On moving the second rod from the hip to the heel, the knee being previously bent, the leg was thrown out with such force, the assistants, who in vain attempted to prevent its extension. I can't even imagine what this is like, having a dead body that's kicking its legs and everything. That must have been quite the sight. Other scientists were doing this stuff as well. A Scottish doctor named Andrew Urey would conduct a similar experiment some years later on another executed criminal. This criminal was named Matthew Clydesdale, and this experiment was described as every muscle of the body was immediately agitated with convulsive movements. The leg was thrown out with such violence as nearly to overturn one of the assistants, who in vain attempted to prevent its extension. Every muscle in his countenance was simultaneously thrown into fearful action. Rage, horror, despair, anguish, and ghastly smiles united their hideous expression in the murderer's face. When the one rod was applied to the slight incision in the tip of the forefinger, the fist being previously clenched, that finger extended instantly, and from the convulsive agitation of the arm, he seemed to point to the different spectators, some of whom thought he had come to life. I really just want to know if Dr. Urey crowed, "It's alive!" What inspired these scientists to try such experiments? Why not just leave electricity at the level of helping patients with arthritis and paralysis? Well, these ideas go all the way back to Aristotle and Hippocrates. They believed in something heavily touted by Charles Darwin in the 1860s. These philosophers championed the idea of pangenes or pangenesis. While Darwin maintained that each part of the body gave off its own small organic particles that traveled to the gonads and led to hereditary traits being passed on, Hippocrates and Aristotle believed that minute pieces of human body parts could combine to create a human being. This would feed into alchemy, which inspired men like Islamist Jabir ibn Hayyan, who strove for the goal of takwin, the creation of life by artificial means in the laboratory. The 16th century alchemist and occultist Paracelsus wrote in 1537 about something called the homunculus, which was supposed to be a miniature human being made out of putrefied sperm and human blood. Let me just pause here for a minute and yuck. Second, yes, ladies, you know that egg has nothing to do with life, right? It's just the sperm and the blood. The next incarnation of weird thoughts on man creating life came from Rabbi Judah Lowell ben Bezalel of Prague, who created a golem. At least that's the claim. He made this thing out of clay from a riverbank, did a Jewish ritual, said some incantations, and named it Yosef. Lazzaro Spalzani was a Catholic priest and professor in the 1700s, and he was obsessed with the idea of reanimating dead tissue. He had claimed that dead microscopic life sprang back to life after adding water to them. He went on to cut the heads off of snails to see if they would grow back. Glad he didn't try that with an executed criminal. His experiments did eventually lead him to discover chemicals in the body that aided in digestion, and he discovered white blood cells, so there's that. That's great stuff. In 1794, the Royal Humane Society of London tried some experiments to restore life to the dead. They believed that since the soul could hang somewhere between life and death, that a corpse could be revived. Their methods were a bit strange. There was the use of electricity and massage, which seems okay, but I'm not sure about the whole forcing of liquor down the throat and siphoning tobacco smoke up the rectum. We've talked about this before. I think in asylums they would try the tobacco up the rectum thing to, I don't know, help people. I mean, really, tobacco smoke up the butt to reanimate the dead? I don't know. The alcohol thing actually made its way over here to America, and a law was passed on August 19th, 1793, that required all owners of places where alcohol was sold to take in persons deemed apparently dead and attempt to use the society's techniques to bring them back to life. And they even had to keep printed directions on hand. Hey, we found a dead body out here on the street. We're going to bring him in. Can we give him a shot of scotch, whiskey? The Soviets started doing reanimation experiments with dogs in the 1940s and 50s after they already had success with severed limbs and removed organs. The main scientist was Dr. S.S. and oh boy, this is a Soviet name, so Bruikhonenko. Uh, he was at the Institute of Experimental Physiology and Therapy. He used arcane and creepy-looking machinery to reanimate dead animals. His most famous experiment was with the decapitated head of a dog that he hooked up to a heart-lung machine, and the head seemed to come alive, even eating and drinking. And I won't get into specifics, but remember there was no body attached to this head, so if it's eating and drinking. Videos were made of this as well as videos of reanimating other dogs' organs and limbs. The claims made by the doctor were that dogs they brought back to life went on to live and even propagate, but many have questioned the authenticity of the film that came out in 1940, featuring all of this named Experiments in the Revival of Organisms. Does anybody buy that? I mean, I don't think any of us do. Was the dog really dead to begin with? I don't know. Another Soviet scientist named Vladimir Demikov conducted experiments where he attached the head of a dead dog to a living one, and supposedly the dead portion of the dog came back to life. He did this with 20 abominations, which sometimes live for up to a month before tissue rejection caused them to die. The 1950s would bring experiments with cryobiology. This is like all those urban legends we hear about Walt Disney. You know, he's frozen on ice somewhere until we find the cure for cancer and bring him back to life. This science froze subjects at very low temperatures and then brought them back to life. One of these scientists to first use this technique was James Lovelock, who was joined by Dr. Audrey Smith at Britain's Mill Hill National Institute of Medical Research, and they used hamsters as their test subjects. The experiments were successful, and eventually radio frequency transmitters were used to create microwaves to heat the bodies. This technology is actually used for freezing and storing organs for transplantation to this day, so I'm glad that they got that part of the science going. A researcher in Japan also conducted similar experiments with cat brains, and he found that he could get brainwave activity even after the brains have been frozen for 2 years. Wow. And of course, we know that some people who fall into freezing ponds and stuff that seem to be dead, we can bring them back sometimes too, but we're not talking months and years of being dead. In 1967, the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio started doing experiments on dogs too. A system of artificial circulation was used to bring back the dogs who revived up to 19 minutes and 30 seconds after death. The dogs reportedly lived for a long while after being brought back. Another experiment was funded by the U.S. government in 1970 when scientist Robert White chopped off the head of a monkey and successfully brought it back to life by grafting it onto the decapitated body of another monkey. That monkey lived for a full day, and the scientists said that the monkey could hear, see, smell, taste, due to the fact that the nerves of the brain and head were fully intact. White wanted to do the same thing with humans, but only managed to find one volunteer. Clearly, he needed two, so he could chop off heads and graft them onto the other body. Some of these people, I'm like, okay. Now, for those of you who know me, know that I have a favorite book out there. My favorite monster is Frankenstein's monster. And so I've always loved the story of Frankenstein, which obviously is key to this whole raising the dead thing. There was this author who was inspired by these early experiments at reanimation. So I shared all of this with you so I could talk a little bit about Frankenstein's monster here. Mary Shelley wrote in the preface to the first edition of her novel Frankenstein in 1818, "The event on which this fiction is founded has been supposed by Dr. Darwin, Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, and some of the physiological writers of Germany as not of impossible occurrence. Galvanism inspired her to write her masterpiece at the young age of 18. Shelley was staying at the Villa Diodati near Lake Geneva with her future husband Percy Shelley, her stepsister Claire Claremont, Dr. John Polidori, and Lord Byron in 1816. Although it was summer, the group was trapped indoors by bad weather caused by an erupting volcano. This was the perfect setting for a little competition to see who could write the scariest story. Mary had a nightmare and scratched out the bones of what would later become her novel featuring a young scientist named Victor Frankenstein who conducts an unorthodox experiment in which he brings unspecified organic matter together and uses some kind of scientific process to bring his creature to life. James Whale's masterpiece film, Frankenstein from 1931, that adapted the story, one of my favorites, and Guillermo del Toro is about to have his Frankenstein drop on Netflix, and I am so looking forward to it. It's supposed to be a really good one that is probably the closest to the actual story. So fingers crossed it is going to be that good. Anyway, he had the scientist using electricity to bring the creature to life after cobbling together a bunch of corpse body parts. The creature horrifies his maker and is abandoned and left to its own devices to find its way in the world. The monster feels rejected and lonely and makes it his mission to destroy his creator. For some, this is a cautionary story of hubris and someone with a god complex. Shelley clearly revealed a dark side to unchecked scientific ambition. So we've got all of this stuff that's gone on, and I was like, what inspired these scientists to do this kind of thing? You've got these philosophers who were inspired by something. What really, really could have been inspiring all of this? Well, all we got to do is look at the Bible to see what could be inspiring people to want to raise the dead. For those of us that are believers, it's only Yahweh that can give life a soul. A creature made in this fashion is soulless. So if you have God separated from this, to me, there's no soul there. That's why I don't like scientists that mess around with cloning and that kind of thing, because I'm like, what is a clone? A clone has to be something soulless. So we just shouldn't even be messing with that. We've talked about the Nephilim many times on this podcast, and that's basically what these things were. These were a created being outside of God's providence, outside of his creation. While Galvanism was an interesting spectacle, no one was actually brought back to life. When we look to the Bible, though, there are several stories of people being brought back to life. Not only were they dead, and now alive, but they go on to live for a while. These are miraculous incidents and definitely odd. The reason this was able to happen is because God is the source of life, and he can give life to whomever he wants. Bodily resurrection is promised. The Greek word for resurrection is anastasis, and it comes from a root that means to raise, arise. And it appears 42 times in the New Testament, which to me is a great thing because it's a hope that we all have. So let's look at some of these stories about being raised from the dead. First, we have the prophet Elijah. He raises a dead boy. This was the widow of Zarephath's son. This is found in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 17 to 24. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill, and his illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, "What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son." And he said to her, "Give me your son." And he took him from her arms and carried him up into the upper chamber where he lodged and laid him on his own bed. And he cried to the Lord, O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son? Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord, O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again. And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah. And the life of the child came into him again, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber into the house and delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, See, your son lives. And the woman said to Elijah, Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. Then we have the Shunammite woman's son. This is in the next book of the Bible, 2 Kings. This is chapter 4, verses 18 to 37. When the child had grown, he went out one day to his father among the reapers. And he said to his father, Oh, my head, my head. The father said to his servant, Carry him to his mother. And when he had lifted him and brought him to his mother, the child sat on her lap till noon, and then he died. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. Then she called to her husband and said, Send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, that I may quickly go to the man of God and come back again. And he said, Why will you go to him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath. She said, All is well. Then she saddled the donkey, and she said to her servant, Urge the animal on. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you. So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, his servant, Look, there is the Shunammite. Run at once to meet her and say to her, Is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child? And she answered, All is well. And when she came to the mountain to the man of God, she caught hold of his feet. And Gehazi came to push her away. But the man of God said, Leave her alone, for she is in bitter distress. And the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. Then she said, Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, Do not deceive me? He said to Gehazi, Tie up your garment and take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him, and if anyone greets you, do not reply, and lay my staff on the face of the child. Then the mother of the child said, As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So he arose and followed her. Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the face of the child. There was no sound or sign of life. Therefore he returned to meet him and told him, The child is not awakened. When Elisha came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on his bed. So he went in and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. Then he went up and lay on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And as he stretched himself upon him, the flesh of the child became warm. Then he got up again and walked once back and forth in the house and went up and stretched himself upon him. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Then he summoned Gehazi and said, Call the Shunammite. So he called her, and when she came to him, he said, Pick up your son. She came and fell at his feet, bowing to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. Now, this was the prophet Elisha. He actually learned a lot from Elijah. He had been his, right-hand guy, his assistant or whatever, and now he's taken over being prophet. And also here in 2 Kings, in chapter 13, verses 20 to 21, there's going to be a man that was raised out of Elisha's grave. So Elisha here is connected with another miracle that occurred after his death. Sometime after he had died and was buried, some men were burying another body in the same area. And the gravediggers saw a band of Moabite raiders approaching, and they got very fearful. They're like, Hey, we got to get out of here. We don't want an encounter with them. So the Bible says, So Elisha died, and they buried him. Now, bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of the year. And as a man was being buried, behold, a marauding band was seen, and the man was thrown into the grave of Elisha. So they're like, throw the body over here. Let's get out of here. And as soon as that man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. What an amazing miracle here, an amazing raising. Elisha's not even alive. He's dead. It's his bones, so he's, decayed quite a bit. And yet, it raised this man because he just touched the bones. And of course, Yeshua raised many people from the dead. Several of the miracles that he performed to prove that he was the Son of God were entailing raising somebody from dead. So the first would be the widow of Nain's son, and this is found in the book of Luke, chapter 7, verses 11 to 17. Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, His disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. So now these people are going, wow, we heard about this, our Old Testament. And of course, they didn't call it the Old Testament back then, but our old books of the Bible, we know that all of our prophets were doing this. He just did what Elijah and Elisha were doing. He must be a prophet. Next, we have Jairus' daughter. This is found in the book of Luke also, chapter 8, verses 40 to 56. Now, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue. And falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter about 12 years of age, and she was dying. As Jesus went, the people pressed around him. And there was a woman who also had this discharge of blood for 12 years. And though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him, this is behind Jesus, and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. So just like Elisha's bones being touched raised this guy from the dead, this woman just touching what Jesus is wearing, she's healed. And Jesus felt it. And he said, "Who was it that touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowd surround you and are pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me." And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him, and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." While he was still speaking, someone from the ruler's house came and said, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." So you can only imagine this father is desperate. He knows that Jesus can heal the sick. And he's like, we've got to get to my daughter. And now he's, what are you doing? Wasting your time with this woman? We're having this discussion. Could we get back to my house? And now his daughter is dead. But Jesus, on hearing this, answered him, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be well." And when he came to the house, he allowed no one to enter with him except Peter and John and James, and the father and mother of the child. And all were weeping and mourning for her, but he said, "Do not weep, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand, he called, saying, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned, and she got up at once. And he directed that something should be given her to eat. And her parents were amazed, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. So he knows he's already stirring up trouble here, so he's like, let's kind of keep this on the down low. I also find it fascinating that, Elijah and Elisha had to go through this whole rigmarole to bring somebody back from the dead. And Jesus is like, "Get up." And that was it. That's all that needed to be said. Now, probably the most famous raising that most people probably know, maybe you remember it from Sunday school or you've heard this story somewhere, is about Lazarus of Bethany. And Lazarus was a really, really good friend of Jesus. He loved to hang out with Lazarus. He had two sisters named Mary and Martha. I'm assuming that none of them have ever gotten married. These siblings were all just living together. And the Bible says, now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him." After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover." Now, Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go that we may die with him." Now, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days, so he's getting pretty ripe. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." And then we have the shortest verse in the entire Bible: Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he's been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. So you can only imagine this looks like the mummy coming out of the tomb. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. And oh boy, as they say, something's going to hit the fan. Various saints in Jerusalem were raised. This is probably one of the craziest stories in the Bible. We've talked about this before. This is found in Matthew chapter 27, verses 50 to 53. Jesus is on the cross. He's going to die here. He cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. I can only imagine what that day was like. It's like, are we being attacked by zombies? Nope, they're actually alive. How did that happen? And a lot of these saints, who knows how long they were dead for. We move into the book of Acts, and now we have the disciples who are going to carry on this act of raising the dead that Jesus had shown them. We have Tabitha, whose Greek name was Dorcas. Now, there was in Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. She was full of good works and acts of charity. In those days, she became ill and died, and when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, urging him, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter rose and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the upper room. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas made while she was with them. But Peter put them all outside and knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And he stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. Also, here in the book of Acts, we have the story of Eutychus. This is chapter 20, verses 7 to 12. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered. And a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms, said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a little longer until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away alive, and were not a little comforted. Now, these are all great stories, interesting stories, but we all know the only person raised from the dead that really matters is Yeshua. Let's look at the book of Mark, chapter 16, verses 1 to 8. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. Very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb, and they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Jesus' resurrection is the first permanent return to life. Everyone else who's been raised to life died again. Lazarus, he died twice. Jesus rose, never more to die. In this way, Jesus is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. His resurrection justifies us and ensures our eternal life. Jesus said in the book of John, chapter 14, verse 19, "Because I live, you also will live." A verse in Job supports that we will have a body in the resurrection. Job 19, verses 25 to 27 reads, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. My heart faints within me." So we are going to be bodily resurrected. We're going to have new bodies. It's not going to be painful to get out of the bed every morning, as it is now for some of us. It's going to be so wonderful. Raising the dead. It can be very, very creepy, but it can also be an amazing blessing. And for those of you who believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, that he also was God, and that he rose from the dead, and that he is still alive today, sitting at the right hand of God, you will be risen one day as well. So there really is nothing to fear in death, because it's just a temporary setting. We'll be alive again one day. The greatest promise of the Bible is that those of us in Christ will all be resurrected again, but not with our old bodies, rather with these new bodies. Will you be raised from the dead? The ghost in you knows. Thank you for joining me on this episode. May God bless you and keep you. This has been a production of History Goes Bump.